is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 411. My name is Marshall. Hi, I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line, all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how are you?
Good. Moved into a new place and been liking it so far.
Man, isn't that stressful?
Yes, but I like where I am a lot more than where I was. So,
so it was an upgrade. Very nice. Oh, congratulations. That's great. Moving to a new place is really hard up front, but as long as you're going somewhere you want to be, it usually ends up being worth it, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
So we've got kind of what's going to end up being the second part of our Ixalan archetype deep dive here. We've dive deeper. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, we should have called it that the first time someone mentioned that. I'm like,
oh, that's great. Yeah. Well, this is the deeper dive, and we're going to be covering, what I view as the rest of the major archetypes in Ixalan. There are, of course, others, but we want to do this as a more broad strokes thing for people that are having a hard time. This format's proven to be a pretty tough nut to crack, and we want to give you an outline so that you can have an idea of all the main field archetypes. And you're going to have to, figure out the blue-white decks on your own or from a different episode. Before we get into all that, though, I want to mention our sponsor, channelfireball.com. That's right. You can go there for all things magic related. Anything that you might find yourself needing, you're going to find it over at CFB, and they're going to ship it out to you nice and quick. They're going to stand by their product and make sure that you get it. And, oh boy, that free content. You get some awesome stuff over at Channel Fireball, including looks like a report from world champion William Huey Jensen. That has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Where he goes over a lot of the stuff that happened at the World Championship that he ended up taking down. And, you get exclusive like that, man. That really does make it worth it to pop in over at CFP every day and see what's going on. Of course, draft videos, constructed videos, sideboard guides, all that kind of stuff there too, so that you can feel good and prepared the next time you head into a Magic tournament. And then, like I said, any of the cards you need or supplies or anything, you can pick them up while you're there. Very easy. Channelfireball.com. Also, you can support the show directly via the Patreon. Another easy way to do it. It's patreon.com/limited resources. All the information is there. And Patreon is just a really cool way for people to give back to the things that, make their life a little better. Or maybe make them a little extra, booster packs or just brighten their day or whatever it happens to be. Fully optional, but we do really appreciate everybody who does support us over on Patreon. What you get as well is access to a bunch of cool stuff, including a question of the week thread. And I've got a very straightforward question here from Joel, who says, Luis, he didn't address it to you, but I'm asking you, can you explain what spiking means? You used the term a lot last week, but didn't explain what you meant by it.
When we say spiking, we just mean like winning something, essentially, or hitting exactly what you needed. Like you spiked the right top deck or you spiked a tournament. So it's pretty simple, but
yeah,
if you hadn't heard it, it doesn't, make too much sense.
Right. It usually has a connotation of luck or being fortunate. Not necessarily that's all it was, but like you said, getting the exact thing you need at the right time.
Like Huey spiked Worlds, not because he wasn't one of the best prepared and best there. I think he was, but he still spiked it. Like it's not like Huey's more than he's not that much more than any given person to win Worlds, right? Like of those 24 players, if
well, you're asking the wrong person for that, but
well, if they each start, at like a little bit more than 4%. To win Worlds, maybe Huey's like 6% or 7%.
Yeah, no, you're totally right.
He's not 25%. So he did spike Worlds despite the fact that he played and, tested very well. So
yeah, and what we were referring to last week is another way to use that similar, term, which is that, sometimes you're in Vampires and it's pack 3 and then boom, you spike a Sanctum Seeker. Right. You spiked exactly the card you need. That's what that word means. Or you just first pick One with the Wind, second pick like Shaper Apprentice, and then you see 5 more Merfolk in a row. You kind of spiked Merfolk because it could have just easily been not that way and you would have a worse deck. That's right. It's weird. I've never actually had anybody ask me that before. That's a poker term too, so I've been using that one for a long time. But I'm glad you asked, Joel, because we do try to strive on the show to make sure that we speak in a way that everybody knows what we're saying. But at the same time, we know our audience is full of Magic players and such, and so we feel like we can use some of the slang. But if we do go off track a little bit with that, I appreciate you guys keeping us on track. So thanks, Joel. Thanks for the question. And that, of course, brings us to or Crack-A-Pack. This one comes from Ian. And I'll also tell you that next week we're going to be giving away the rares for the past few Crack-A-Packs. Actually, it's quite a few of them now. They've piled up because I don't usually give them away during the thing. And I've also got another pile of them. So a really nice guy named Krishna came up at GP Providence, and he had been drafting a lot over the course of the weekend, and he just gave me his rares. He's just like, here. And so we're giving them away. He's like, you can put them into the pile for the Patreon giveaway. So I've got a bunch of extra rares here to give away. And then, of course, the ones from the Crack-A-Packs as well. And those will be being sent out next week. All you have to do to be eligible for those, super easy. Just be a patron. That's it. And you're automatically entered. All right, let's get into it. First card is called Fire Shrine Keeper. You do not see these on the battlefield very often, do you, Luis?
No, though I do think it is actually playable.
Do you really?
More than what it looked like. Yeah, in the really low curve aggressive decks, especially with like swashbucklings or a bunch of good raid cards. Yeah, you can play a Fire Shrine Keeper, but not my favorite card. This is the 1/1 menace for red.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we should mention that, shouldn't we? Yeah, and then you can pay 8 mana, tap and sack it to do 3 damage up to each of 2 target
Especially
creatures.
like it in like aggressive pirates decks that have a couple treasure makers, and then you can like get to 8 sometimes too.
Mm-hmm. I thought this was going to be a raid enabler, but I have found that I'd rather just not play it in my deck. Because, yeah, turn 1, it does enable raid, but the raid payoffs haven't ended up being so great.
They're not great.
Right. Pterodon Knight is next. That's the 3 and a white 3/3. It gets flying if you control a dinosaur. Super filler, right? It's just like whatever.
Moderate reward if you've got 5 or more dinos in your deck.
Right. Blightkeeper.
This is another of the 1 mana 1/1. This is a 1 mana 1/1 flyer for a black. And you can pay 8 and sack it to drain your opponent for 4. Again, like the Fire Shrine Keeper is playable in the most aggressive decks, but none of these cards are cards I'm starting with.
No, I like Blightkeeper better than Fire Shrine Keeper, but I don't really like either particularly. Next is Tillinolly's Knight. We're going to talk about that one a little later on today. The 1 and a red 2/2, but when it attacks, if you control a dinosaur, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn.
This is the leading contender. It is a fine first pick.
Yeah. Opt. We've talked a lot about Opt, but we're not going to be first picking it. Blossom Dryad. Ended up not really being so much of a Blossom Dryad format.
It's 2 and a green for a 2/2 that you can untap a land, but this isn't a ramp format, so I think the card's bad.
No. We're going to talk a little bit about ramp today, too, in one of our archetypes, but unfortunately it's secondary. Paladin of the Bloodstained. You know, I do like this card at 4 mana. It's 3 and a white for a 3/2, and you get a 1/1 lifelink vampire token with it as well.
Yeah, I think it's a fine card. I would take Tillinolly's Knight over it, though.
Same, yeah, just based on cost. Blinding Frog. Yes, I called it Blinding Frog. No, we're not going to play it. Here we go. Contract Killing. Got it.
All right. 3 black for sorcery that kills any creature and you get 2 treasure tokens. Yeah, I would start with Contract Killing over Tillinolly's Knight.
I would too, yeah. Siren Storm Tamer. Card's been pretty good. This is the blue 1/1 flyer. And you can pay a blue and sack it to counter target spell or ability that targets you or a creature you control.
Yeah, I like this because it's a 1/1 flyer for 1, which is actually good in your opening hand. Mm-hmm. And the ability means it's relevant later in the game. So I would generally play this in my blue decks.
Yeah, I would too. I still think I'm going to take Contract Killing over it at this point, though. Yeah, okay. Dusk Legion Dreadnought. I'm curious about where you're at on this one. This is the 5 mana 4/6 vehicle with Vigilance with Crew 2.
I do like this card. I tend to play it. Okay. I tend to take it fairly early, but I think it's worse pick 1, pack 1 than Contract Killing. Is that true? Yeah, that's true. I would take Contract Killing.
Yeah, I think so too. Next one I liked more at the beginning of the format than I do now, but it's probably still fine. It's Bellowing Aegisaur.
Yeah, this is 5 and a white for a 3/5 dinosaur and has Enrage, put a +1/+1 counter on all your other creatures. It is a playable card. It's a notch above filler, and some decks do quite want it with Pounce, but again, it's a 6 mana card and doesn't super impact the board right away because a lot of the removal or bounce just deals with it.
Right. Yeah. And then also, you know, we have not found that building decks just to enrage has really been much of a thing, right? So you can make it work with fight cards and just getting into combat occasionally, but for the most part, you know, you can't just trigger it at will. Our rare, 2 rares. Ooh, we got a sweet one too. All right, first one is Rowdy Crew, mythic rare.
Yeah, this is a weird mythic. It's 2 red for a 3/3 pirate, and then when you play or enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards, then discard 2 cards at random, which is a good ability. Like that is an upside ability, and then
I mean, you're up a card in that transaction, right?
you are up a card, and because you have Rowdy Crew in your deck, sometimes you can just like not play extra lands, and it'll get you out of a flood situation.
Mm-hmm.
And if the 2 cards you discarded share a type, so if they're both lands or both creatures or both artifacts, that last one probably unlikely. Rowdy Crew gets 2+1/+1 counters. So when you spike with Rowdy Crew, it is quite good.
Very good, very good. Using our words. Rowdy Crew's cool.
I would still take Contract Killing, I think. Though I don't know. Rowdy Crew's pretty good.
I would just take Rowdy Crew myself.
Yeah, it's probably the pick.
Like when you spike with it, it's gross. And then also, like, I know it's not quite the same, but I mean, doesn't Rowdy Crew say 3/3 trample for 4, you draw a card?
Yeah, I guess actually no, Rowdy Crew is better than Contract Killing.
And then sometimes it's 5/5 trample. That's pretty good. Man, we got actually a really sweet rare. This one is going to go into that giveaway too, and it's probably got to be worth something now. It's Search for Azcanta foil.
Ooh, so this is the 1 in a blue enchantment that at the start of your turn you get to look at your top card, and you can put it in your graveyard or on top of your deck, and then you can flip this if you have 7 or more cards in your deck or in your graveyard into Azcanta the Sunken Ruin, which is a card we saw a lot at Worlds and Standard.
Oh boy, and at Nationals this last weekend too.
Yeah, it taps for a blue, or you can pay 2 blue and tap it. Look at your top 4 cards and take a non-land, non-creature from them, put it in your hand, and put the rest on the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So
I would not take it over Rowdy Crew though.
No, it's not. It's not a great card in Limited. I don't think it's playable in the vast majority of decks. So
no, I agree.
Yeah, I would take Rowdy Crew followed by Contract Killing, followed by Tillinolly's Night, then Dust Legion Dreadnought, I think.
Yeah, that's where I'm at too. But I will put this Search for Azcanta in the pile here, so that's a pretty sweet one.
Yeah, that is.
Next week we will be shipping this away. It looks great too, man. Double face cards that are foil just have some really neat, like especially the land side of these. Wow. Anyway, okay, so that's gonna do it for the Crack-a-Pack. We got Rowdy, but speaking of Rowdy Crew, we got to move on to the main topic here, which is again our dive deeper, and we're talking this time. Last week we went over vampires, right? We also went over merfolk last week, and then the red-white deck, which is. Some people call it red-white dinosaurs, but as we talked about it, it's more just a red-white aggro deck. And this week, we're going to be focusing on one of the major tribes that tends to break out into different color pairs, which is pirates. And then we're also going to talk about dinosaurs as well. So why don't we start off with pirates here, Luis, and I'll let you kick it off.
So pirates is a kind of interesting tribe where they're in the Grixis colors, black, red, and blue, which means that they're a lot more flexible, both because they're in 3 colors and because, as we'll get into, they're a little bit more generic than merfolk, certainly, and also vampires.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of like 2.5, I would say, different archetypes under pirates. There's, red, black, and blue, red. And we're going to go more deep on blue, black, and red, black, because I think blue, red's kind of just like the least drafted and a midpoint between the 2 of them. And once we've covered those 2, we kind of get the idea. So
it's also very much the least drafted, right? I mean,
yes, by a lot.
Yeah.
So as a result, black is the safest color to be in if you want to hedge, because blue, black, and red, black are a lot more likely to be where you end up than blue, red. So, black touches both of those.
Right.
In general, pirates is an aggressive strategy still, even though the blue, black splash pirates, is one of the sweeter decks in the format. This is actually one of the few places where you can kind of go off the rails a little bit. But, red, black, and blue, red are all capable of just being good curve-out aggressive decks. Pirates Cutlass is overall the best card for these decks. And because of how good it is in vampires, it just keeps moving up my pick order in how early I'm willing to take it in the first couple of picks.
Yeah, but it's like critical for these decks, right?
It's critical for blue-black more than black-red.
Okay.
Because blue-black's creatures kind of suck. So if they want to be an aggressive deck, they kind of need the Cutlass, and they have flyers. It's like really good on like Siren Lookout, for example.
Oh yeah.
But it's good. It's great in black red still. It's still a great card there. Black red actually has kind of like, it has like Fathom Fleet, Firebrand, and Heartless Brute, so it can kind of get in there without Cutlass. But you need your Sailor of Memes and your Siren Lookouts to really get in there. Pirates is less tribal than Merfolk, and a little less tribal. Like, it's much less tribal than Merfolk and a little less tribal than vampires, because besides Cutlass and Siren's Root, you don't really need, or Siren's Ruse, you don't really need a lot of pirates. Like, Heartless Brute does want other pirates, but most of your cards don't really care that they have other pirates. They're like pirates. They don't care about anyone but themselves. So
they're selfish, yeah.
Right. You don't.
So good flavor.
You don't need to look at this as super tribal, which is important to know because it does leave you open. Pirates is one of those decks, like kind of a white-red aggro, where you'll play your 2-mana cards regardless of what type they have on their type line. Queen's Base Soldier does fine work in a red-black deck. And because, of these things, because Pirates is in 3 colors, because it's less tribal, you can kind of hedge on it. And this is one of the few archetypes where if you're in some combination of these colors, you can kind of decide even up to pack 2 where you want to end up. Whereas a Merfolk deck that you go into pack 2 is just barely going to be functional.
Right.
So looking at red-black Pirates, I think this is the most common build. Though blue-black is a close second. Its top-level strategy is just curve out and use removal to clear the way. Like, that's it. Red-black is not doing anything particularly complicated or sweet. It is beating down, which I think, is a fine place to be in this format. So this is a good deck. The key commons, Pirate's Cutlass, number 1. I actually have Skullduggery as number 2. It's a little aggressive, but I think that...
I think you're right.
I think a 1-mana removal spell that sometimes is even a 2-for-1 is so much better than even something like Fire Cannon Blast, which I do have at number 3. I just don't feel like when I cast Fire Cannon Blast, I'm getting an advantage. You're paying 3 mana to kill something that frequently costs 2 or 3 mana.
Right.
And if you have to wait till post-combat, yes, that's great. You got to kill their 5-drop dinosaur, but sometimes you have to make suboptimal attacks or you didn't remove a blocker.
Yeah, with Skullduggery, especially in this red-black version, you're just constantly applying pressure and making them play into it.
And they double block your Heartless Brooder, Direfleet Interloper, and you just get them.
Yeah.
So
it is good.
Fathom Fleet Firebrand, also a card that's overperformed. I have this 4th after Fire Cannon Blast. And then you have the generic black removal spells like Vanquish the Weak and Contract Killing, which are fine picks early because they can go anywhere. They're just good cards. You have Heartless Brute, which I think moves up past the removal if you need more creatures and you have enough pirates in your curve. Because sometimes you play this and your opponent knows they're just never going to profitably block it, especially since this deck has tons of removal. It has all the black and red removal, so your opponent leaves 2 blockers back, you kill 1 attack for 3. They do that a few times and you just got a ton of value.
Mm-hmm.
And then moving down, you have Unfriendly Fire, which can move up because it nugs the opponent, but I usually like Contract Killing more because it kills anything and the 2 treasures make it so you can double spell on turn 5 a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the curve fillers like, Direfleet Hoarder. Skymarch Bloodletter I found to be perfectly acceptable in this deck.
Yeah,
3-mana 2/2 flyer is just good.
Yeah. And of course in a red-black deck you are looking to beat down, so the little drain of 1 is sometimes relevant.
Desperate Castaways is an interesting one. This kind of has an asterisk, literally, if you look at the notes. Because if you can't attack with it, it's really bad in this deck. But once you're at 4 or 5 ways to make treasure or have a cutlass, then it becomes a legit 2-drop. So
yeah, how do you know?
You just don't take it early. It doesn't move up in your pick order until you're double cutlass and a couple treasure makers. And even then it's not insane. It's just fine.
Yeah. I've just found it really hard to fit into this deck because what treasure maker?
Contract Killing is one of them.
Yeah, I don't want a 2-drop.
Sometimes this deck does play Wily Goblin, though I don't love it in the deck. Direfleet Hoarder. So Castaways is more like the backup 2-drop that you play on turn 4 or 5 alongside another spell.
Rather than the thing you're aiming to run out on turn 2.
Right.
Yeah.
Mark of the Vampire is good in this deck. It's good on menace creatures. It's good at racing. And Stormfleet Pyromancer is kind of the 5 that you don't mind playing, the 3/2 that, pings for 2 if you had raid.
Yeah, don't forget it can go upstairs. You can hit your opponent with it.
Swashbuckling, I have a question mark because if your curve is low enough, I do like the card. This is the format for it, but in a good deck with a good curve, often you don't really need the Swashbuckling. It just opens you up to risks you don't need to take.
Yeah, that's what I've found too. Every time I think about running it, that's not the all-in style deck with the 1-drops and all that. I'm like, why am I doing this?
Yeah, you just don't need to. You could just have taken better cards.
Right.
The filler commons are all pretty interchangeable. These are the 2-drops like Queen's Base Soldier, Nest Robber, Till and Ollie's Knight, perfectly playable. And sometimes you end up with a Thrash of Raptors, and a Frenzied Raptor, and it attacks as a 3/3, and you feel like you got away with something.
Yeah.
Cards like, Fathom Fleet Cutthroat, Direfleet Interloper, Brazen Buccaneer, all super replaceable.
Mm-hmm.
The premium uncommons, besides the obvious ones, which we don't mention, by the way, in these dive downs, Charging Monstrosaurs, just obviously ultra premium in any red deck. But the specific pirate-based ones are Fiery Cannonade, which, Pyroclasm, which I found to be awesome, even in an aggressive deck, especially if you have all pirates at 2, if all your small creatures are pirates. This is where you start to care a little bit more.
Definitely.
Merfolk and Vampires could just never beat this card. Vampires especially can never beat it. Sometimes Merfolk has one with the wind and doesn't care that much. And then
yeah, but sometimes they cast one with the wind and
right.
then you cast Fiery Cannon.
The first time I got a Jade Guardian killed by this in response to the counter going on.
Oh no. How does it work? Is it that the trigger goes on for the Jade
Guardian targets something and then you just get to cast Fiery Cannon?
So even if it targets itself, you're just like,
yeah.
Wow, that's nasty.
Lightning Rig Crew, the 05 is great in this deck. The pings for 1 and untaps when you play a pirate.
Yeah, it gives you an alternate method of pressure, right?
It's like 1.5 unblockable damage a turn, which is good because it also blocks their attacks. Because, I mean, even aggressive decks care about their life total. So the ways to get into this, it's, again, we're going to see with pirates, is it's not as cut and dry as it is for like Merfolk or Vampires where we're like, oh, I got an Anointed Deacon 4th or a Jade Guardian and a 1 with the wind over at picks 3 and 4. For pirates, it's like, is red and black open? You know, this is normal drafting. This is drafting that could be applied to any set. Like, am I getting good red and black cards, picks 4, 5, and 6? If the answer is yes, then yeah, it's fine to be red-black because you'll fill out your curve and it doesn't matter too much what's going on. You just know you're going to get enough playables. Getting past Pirates Cutlass is another way to get into Pirates. It's not going to happen very often at this point in the format, but it could. So it's not super narrow how you get into this archetype, which I think is an advantage because it just means that if you notice red and black is open, you can kind of just slide in here. The skeleton for pirates, pirate skeleton sounds quite fearsome.
March of the Drowned, yeah.
Like 4 to 6 2-drops, 4 to 6 3-drops, ideally a couple Heartless Brutes in there, 3 5+ drops. So you're not really looking at a high curve. This is like 2-drop, 3-drop, and then a couple 4-drops as well, like 2 to 4. So you're looking at a pretty low curve, and more 2-drops and more 3-drops is generally better than the higher end. You can rarely have too many 2s, and you can definitely have too many 4s. If you're lucky, 2 Pirates Cutlass, but even 0 is fine in red-black. It doesn't need it to be a good aggressive dex.
Yeah, it just feels so nasty when the turn when you cast it, equip something, attack, maybe even play a spell afterwards, right?
Yeah, it is. It can be really brutal.
Yeah, because you're really capitalizing.
Also, again, this deck has access to a couple Menace Pirates, which really makes it hard for your opponent. 3 to 5 removal spells, not out of reach for this deck. There's just a lot of black and red removal. These are the removal colors.
Yeah, for sure.
A pair of combat tricks. Skullduggery, obviously the premier one, but also Sure Strike. Sure Strike is good in this deck. You'll usually play 1, sometimes 2, depending on how much room you have. This is a heavy creature-based deck, so you're talking about 14 to 17 creatures or so, and then the rest removal spells or combat tricks. And that's basically it. Like, it's not super complicated.
Well, yeah, and that is something we should mention here too, right? Is it as with a lot of the decks in this format, you are incentivized to build that, cab style deck, that cards that affect the board state. So the quick check for that is to lay out your deck and look at each of your cards and decide, just look at each one and say, is this a creature, that can attack? Is this a combat trick or is this a removal spell? And any card that doesn't fit that category, you should be suspect of. It doesn't mean you shouldn't play it. There's some exceptions. Like, for example, Pirates Cutlass doesn't really directly fit into those, but it's sort of like a repeatable combat trick is one way to think about that. But, if you have, not in these colors, but if you have a Pirate's Prize style card in your deck and you think, well, I'm Pirates and I can use treasure and that's cool. It might work. But also, you can't have too many of those types of cards in a deck like this. So make sure that you are keeping it pretty low to the ground and keeping it clean as far as those type of cards go. Yeah,
this and Red-White are the 2 most Cabsies decks in the format, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
And so some notes about Red-Black. Like I said, not very focused. You don't care a ton about Pirates. You don't care a ton about much besides curve and removal.
Yep.
It plays like a traditional Red-Black aggro deck. And you can hedge and end up here late because it's so flexible. So,
yeah. Late game stuff, there's really not much, right? Bombs or anything along those lines.
Yeah, you're not going to play like Suncrown Hunters, for example, very often.
Exactly. Yeah. Do you find that this is a 16 land deck?
Ideally 16 land. If your curve is low enough to play 16 land, I think that you can be happy with where the archetype ended up.
I've been doing that whenever I can get away with it here too. Because you look at these cards and they're fine. A lot of good, powerful stuff on curve, but there's not a whole lot going on the top end. A, you don't really want 6 drops in a deck like this anyway. And B, the this particular set just doesn't have a lot of repeatable ways to use your mana, in the late game in this color pair. Not even something like
Pirates
a jungle
Cutlass.
Yes, Cutlass is a good one. Yeah, that is your best.
That's red-black, which I think you're going to end up with in a little more often because, again, it needs fewer like unique pieces than something like blue-black. Like it is easier to get into.
So I wanted to ask you before we move on to blue-black, do you like this deck?
Red-black? Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that, like, if I handed you a B, let's say red-black deck, and I said, okay, it's day 2 of a GP and you're about to play your thing, would you be like, okay, cool. Yeah, that's good. Because I know you, like, if I gave you a B level Merfolk deck, you'd be like, sweet, but what about red-black pirates? Is it on your list? Is it the type of archetype you actually want to be in?
Yeah, I think red-black is a good place to be. This is the one where if it's open, then it's a good place to be.
Okay.
Whereas something like white-green dinosaurs, I would not want to be in white-green dinosaurs, which we are going to talk about later, unless it was like very clear this was open,
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So blue-black is a little bit more open-ended because it's often treasure-based and can splash colors. Like, again, the one-sentence strategy is like a mid-range deck that can play either grindy or aggressive depending on the card pool. Mm-hmm. And what that means is it isn't locked in like red-black. Like, yes, you could conceivably make a red-black control vampire deck, but I don't think that that's going to be very common. Whereas blue-black, if you say I'm playing blue-black pirates, I don't know with too much certainty whether it's aggressive or more mid-range or controlling because it could be either.
Yes, but and generally, I've noticed that it's more towards the controlling end of things, just because of a lot of the commons that go into it. But Pirates Cutlass does change that equation quite a bit.
Yes, and Pirates Cutlass is still the best common for this archetype. So for key common, it starts with the Cutlass. I like
Is Pirates Cutlass a good card?
Yeah, maybe a little. I like Siren Lookout actually better than all the black removal spells for this deck, especially if you have Cutlass and Siren's Ruse, because Siren Lookout, this is the Tuna Blue 1/2 flying Explorer.
Yeah. It's
just very efficient. It's good value. You're just really happy with it almost no matter what, though you'd usually rather have it be a 2/3.
Yeah. Yeah, you almost always want to hit with it. Yeah.
I like Vanquish the Weak over Skullduggery because, again, this deck doesn't force combat as much and the stats are a little less present than in red-black. And then same with Contract Killing. I actually have that above Skullduggery as well, though then I have Skullduggery. Followed by Desperate Castaways, which I think is quite good in this deck because you're more defensive or more likely to be defensive, and you have more treasure, so it can just, you cast Sailor Memes on turn 3 and you can just attack with the Castaways.
Sure.
Siren's Ruse is next, though this is kind of a weird subset where some of these decks don't actually want Siren's Ruse. This is the 1 in a blue, blink a creature, and if it's a pirate, you draw a card. If you have a lot of pirates and good enter the battlefield abilities, this card's very powerful. But an aggressive blue-black deck that isn't really messing around, you don't actually really want this.
Yeah, where's the bar? Like, I mean, because you wouldn't blink, like you wouldn't play it just to blink a creature and draw a card that often, right? Like if that's all it did. So like if you blink a Sailor Means, are you happy?
It can be okay. It's a good race card because you can like block and blink your blocker, and you gain a bunch of life and drew a card.
Basically, when you have blink a tapped creature and bring it back to block.
Exactly. When you have like 4 more pirates with a couple of which have entered a battlefield abilities like Lookout or Prosperous Pirates, alongside 4 other random pirates. So we're talking about 7 or 8 pirates in general, and then a couple pirates, non-pirates with good abilities like Water Trap Weaver or Tempest Caller is actually great with this because you can, beginning a combat, blink and tap the whole team down. So that's around the point where Siren's Ruse becomes good, which is why I do not generally advocate taking Siren's Ruse super early because you just don't know if you're going to get there. The next couple are the 2 treasure generator creatures at common, Sailor Memes and Prosperous Pirates, which are both important if you're trying to splash. You don't know if you're going to be, but if you are, Prosperous Pirates, for example, is your best bet. Besides Contract Killing, which of course you want as many as you can get. Because a Prosperous Pirates can cast like a Regisaur Alpha, right? Mm-hmm. You can cast double splash cards off Prosperous Pirates and it's really powerful.
Yeah. And it's also just a solid body on its own, right?
Yeah, 5 mana 3/4 is fine. It's kind of like a 3 mana 3/4 if you want a double spell on turn 5 too, right? You can play this and play a spell immediately. So
right.
And then Water Trap Weaver is next, though this moves up above all these like ruses and treasure makers if you're in the more beatdown version.
Okay.
I like Depth of Desire. Everyone's putting auras on everything in this format, so this is the bounce spell that makes a treasure. So this card has been fine.
I found it totally fine too, even though I feel like it's maybe a little undervalued right now. Just as cards like Mark of the Vampire go up, I'm thinking, this is the type of card I want to have access to. But I see them go quite late. So I don't know. Maybe just I'm a little too high on them, or maybe everybody else is a little too low.
Yeah, you do hit a wall where you don't want too many of this kind of effect, because there's also like Perilous Voyage and Run Aground. But I think the first couple are pretty valuable.
Yeah, I agree.
Dive Down I do like in this deck. It's worse than Siren's Ruse if you're a good Ruse deck, but it's a good replacement, and it's just a good combat trick. This is the +0/+3 for blue. And then Mark of the Vampire is still good here. You can put it on your flyer, and it does some work. Siren Lookout into Mark of the Vampire, your opponent is just going to lose if they don't have an answer.
Yeah, I wonder where you should be prioritizing it. You know what I mean?
It's hard to know.
Because this is not a key part of the strategy. It's just an option that you have. So I have a hard time finding, I know I want Pirate's Cutlass, right? I know I'm willing to spend a very early pick on it if I'm in this deck, and I feel just fine about it. But when it comes to Mark of the Vampire, I'm like, well, I think I want one in my pile somewhere. I don't know if I want it main or side. I don't know exactly when I want to bring it in, and I don't really know how many I want,
Yeah, it depends on your creature makeup as well, because if you have decent creatures, then you don't need to take this risk. But because this deck has a lot of good ways to stall out the game, rusing your Water Trap Weaver and stuff like that. And if you have Cutlass, which is the better version of all this, but sometimes Mark of the Vampire is exactly the kind of card, just like One with the Wind, that can make bad decks crush good decks.
Yes, that's true. And obviously you're taking on significant risk by doing so, but you'll take it. If you can't play the fair game.
So the filler commons for this deck are Direfleet Hoarder, Direfleet Interloper, Shipwreck Looter, the random pirates. And here, this deck cares a little bit more about the creature type pirate than red-black because of Siren's Ruse. March of the Drowned can also fit into this deck if you're playing a little more controlling.
Yeah, did we mention March of the Drowned for the red-black version?
We didn't, because I tend not to main
that good
deck
in there,
card.
right?
Yeah, it's a good sideboard card.
Too. It does seem fine here, though, right? Comparatively speaking. Yeah,
I think it is generally a little better here because you're looking to trade off and stall and getting good value creatures back. You're not looking to curve out as often. Run Aground is fine here. You do want a couple bounce spells, and this moves up later in the draft if you don't have them. And then Pirate's Prize, the 3 in a blue, draw 2, make a treasure. That has been fine here. It's not great, and you don't want a lot of them, but it can do what it wants.
I think you want one.
Yeah, I think honestly, you want a half of one.
Yeah, I agreed. My main point is that I don't think you want two. The second one in your hand, given how aggressive the format is, and given that it's 4 full mana, that is a really big chunk of mana to invest to get a couple of cards back. You're kind of playing with fire there. Also, I wouldn't be if you play one in your main deck, okay, but you shouldn't be afraid to take it out if you do find somebody who's really curving out on you hard, where you're not going to be able to find the time to cast it. Yeah,
and the premium uncommons for this are Stormfield Aerialist is the 1 in a blue 1/2 flying raid, and it's a 2/3 if you have raid. This card is just really good. Mm-hmm. Deadeye Plunderers, the blue-black gold card, I found it to be fantastic. The 3/3 for 5, that's ++1 for each artifact you have, which frequently is a 7/7. You can pay 4 mana to make more treasures. And then Splashable Bombs. One of the powerful parts about this deck is you get to take the off-color Monstrosaur. You get to take the Vraska or Huatli, these cards that other decks won't get to take. If you're a Vampires deck and you open up something like Charging Monstrosaur, you're just not going to take it. You can't just play 3 mountains in your black-white deck. But if you're this deck, you just take it and cast it off a treasure. Turn 3 Sailor, turn 4 Monstrosaur. that is a real thing.
Game. Yeah, I've seen that happen.
So Splashable Bombs are very important to include as one of the upsides of this deck.
Yeah. Now, do you view these as a necessary? Is this just part of the puzzle? Where you wouldn't want to play this deck unless you had some Splashable Bombs, because of that upside, or is this optional?
It's optional if you're the version that has a bunch of treasure makers, because you can draft a blue-black aggressive deck that has 5 or 6 2-drops, 2 Cutlass or 1 Cutlass, like a couple Water Trap Weavers, some decent flyers, and removal and bounce, and just you don't care about any of these things. You're just beating down. But then once you get like a contract killing, 2 Prosperous Pirates, 2 Sailor of Memes, and like 2 Sirens Ruse, all of a sudden you're like in a completely different area, and then you're looking for these off-color bombs.
Right. So that's that to me is a big dividing line between the two kind of versions of this blue-black deck, right? Is if you do have something that incentivizes you to use the treasure to really go over the top of your opponent, or if you're really just trying to lean on the synergies that are inherent to this color pair on its own. So keep that in mind. So
a skeleton for this deck, it's a little tricky because there's different versions, but you still want 2 to 4 2-drops, even in the controlling version. You can't just not get on the board on turn 2. This is where Desperate Castaways really comes into play.
Yeah, and we talk about that we call that defensive speed, right? Like
exactly.
It's good for this deck, but it's also just so you don't die.
You want 4 to 6 3-drops, a couple of the Sailors, the 1/4, just because it's really important to have a good defensive body and generate treasure if you're looking to splash. 4 4-drops. In a version with Siren's Ruse, which is what I've kind of written down here, 1 Tempest color is really good in this deck. I actually like it more here than in Merfolk because
you can
it's a good finishing blow.
Yeah.
You can have 4 or so 5+ drops, including multiple Prosperous Pirates. You really do want these. 2 to 4 removal spells, including a contract killing. A couple bounce spells, including Depths of Desire. If you have more removal, you can go lighter on the bounce, but we're not always lucky enough to pick up like 5, hard removal spells. As many Pirates Cutlass as you can get, If you don't have Cutlass, one of the advantages to this deck is you get to splash the off-color bombs, and that's why you end up not the beatdown version as much. It's really hard to run the beatdown version without Cutlass. Mm-hmm. So something like 2 off-color bombs is nice. Overflowing Insight is a card I found fine in this deck. This is 7 mana, draw 7.
We found it home?
I've had it multiple times in this deck and have it been good, and seen other people draft it and have it been good in this deck.
Yes, thank God.
And since this is a skeleton for like the more mid-rangey version, like 2 copies of Siren's Ruse.
I thought you were going to say 2 copies of Overflowing Insight. I was like, wow, you are a dreamer.
And then you'd play a Skullduggery or a Dive Down. These cards are both good in this deck. So
just because they do things to the board and are cheap interactive spells.
Exactly.
Right? You're not like flexing these, but they're just good.
This deck can play as aggro again with Cutlass, or if you have like high damage cards like Dusk Legion Dreadnought or Fell Flagship, Stormfleet Aerialist. You need some punch. You're not going to find it at common without Cutlass very often. Mm-hmm. If you have enough Siren Lookouts, I guess you could assemble that, and play like Windstriders, as just like the 3/3 flyer. But for the most part, you're really going to need something at uncommon or higher. If you have 4 to 6 treasure sources, you can really be aggressive with your splashes. And sometimes you don't even want to play lands. Like if you have Huatli off contract killing, double Prosperous Pirates, and then like 3 or 4 one-off treasure makers, just don't play mountains or plains. You can just play it completely off of the treasure makers.
Right. Which feels weird, right? You're kind of flying without, walking without a net, but you can get away with it. You just have to be careful to make sure that you use your treasure in smart ways. Don't just, fire it off and not give yourself the out of drawing your Huatli or whatever.
Yeah, it has because this deck does have actual good defensive options and lots of bounce and removal, you really can play as a grindy deck, which is a rarity in this format. You're going to lose to Jade Guardian a lot of the time, though. I'm sorry to say. Also, opposing Pirates Cutlass is really annoying because you're trying to, 1-for-1 your opponent a lot and hope your 1/4s and 3/4s can actually block, and Cutlass cuts through that pretty easily. Mm-hmm. So these two sides of the spectrum, they kind of overlap enough that Blue-Red Pirates is not something we really want to go super deep into because it's a little bit more aggressive than Blue-Black and less aggressive than Red-Black, which is, I think, why it's drafted less. It just does both those things a little less well.
Mm-hmm. It's less focused.
But again, if blue and red, the colors are open, then you can just end up here. Fathom Fleet Firebrand plus, Siren Lookout plus bounce spells is still just like a decent place to be. Headstrong Brute still good, or Heartless Brute is still good here. And Siren's Ruse can be cute here with like Stormfleet Pyromancer or Stormfleet Arsonist and Uncommon. So
yeah, and you get Marauding Looters, right?
Yeah, Marauding Looters a great reason to be blue-red. So that's kind of how pirates end up. Again, you can hedge, you can be pirates, and if you start with a Cutlass, you lean towards pirates or vampires, and you'll probably end up in a pretty decent spot.
Okay, so before we move on to the red-green and the dino builds, weaknesses. Let's go back. Let's just rewind a little bit to the black-red version. What are the weaknesses of the deck?
Black-red, if it doesn't have a good curve, you mentioned this earlier, it doesn't have much of a late game. So let's say you just miss your 2-drop, right? Like you just have a keep opening hand, but you don't play a 2. And your opponent, your like Dino's opponent, goes Fire Cannon Blast on your Heartless Brute. And all of a sudden they're at like 18 on turn 5 or 6. They're going to start playing cards that you're not going to be able to keep up with. And your cards are really bad defensively. Like the Brute can't even block.
Just straight up can't block.
Your Direfleet Interloper, Menace cards are just not known for their defensive prowess. So this deck doesn't play that well from the back foot and doesn't play that well in the late game, but it has such a strong and consistent early game. Usually that's not a big issue.
Okay. And then we're talking about the blue-black version. What are the weaknesses there?
The blue-black version, again, it has problems with Pirate's Cutlass or like recurring threats. Like Dusk Legion Dreadnought can be very effective against this deck. You can't contract killing it or vanquish it. It's a little vulnerable to bounce, but this deck can, it can lose a late game to even an aggressive deck if they have the right cards. And that's always true of control decks. It's one of the risks is you don't get the free early wins, but sometimes you still lose the long games. It also has a little bit of consistency issues. Sometimes you'll draw your Regisaur Alpha, but your 4 double treasure cards are just all not present.
Yeah,
or you had to use them earlier. You played a Prosperous Pirate, but you had to spend the treasure because you needed to get on the board, and then all of a sudden you can't play your splash cards. So
okay.
Blue-black also has the issue sometimes of just not being able to close the game because its creatures are kind of small if you don't have Cutlass.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good stuff. Not exactly how I thought Pirates would have panned out. When we first started playing the set, like during the pre-release and stuff. But I'm kind of glad that there's at least a couple different flavors within this archetype because it makes the set a little bit more diverse from an archetype perspective. Where if all the Pirates decks felt the same, I think I'd be a little disappointed, So it's a good thing. Why don't we move on to dinosaurs here? We'll start off with the main build, I guess, which is red-green dinosaurs. That's the one that sort of has stood out to me as being the most, the one you see the most at least. Usually has a red-green base, but sometimes it has white cards in there too. It's kind of like the slightly bigger cousin to the more streamlined decks we've been talking about here. It's pretty well positioned in the format in that it's generally just a bit slower than the faster decks, which is kind of where you want to be. But it does lack a lot of the tribal punch that the others have. There's really not a ton going on for dinosaurs as far as tribal stuff goes. You get a few payoffs here and there. We'll talk about those as we go through. Some of the notes to head in here, as usual, here on Ixalan, it tends to be a more aggressive strategy than not, though it is, as I mentioned, not quite as fast as some of the other aggressive decks in the format. It gives up a bit of that speed in exchange for a stronger late game threats, and also those threats tend to just be stronger on their own. So that's, that matters. That's a real thing. It's just sometimes you're too dead to realize the advantage of that. There's a ramp version of the deck as well that we'll talk about after this one. This one we're calling the normal version or the more baseline version, of the deck. And like I said, the tribal synergies aren't really a focus here. It's more about individual cards and how they interact. So let's get into it. First off, this is a curve out deck. It's a beatdown deck. You win by forcing an opponent to block and then leveraging combat tricks or just your bigger creatures to gain an advantage. You're just bigger than the opponent is. And then one thing to keep in mind is that Enrage, while fine, there's some decent Enrage triggers in the set. It is not something that you're building around. You don't need to draft cards specifically to trigger Enrage, and the payoffs generally haven't really been so impressive that you felt the need to do so.
Yeah, Enrage is not really a theme, just like Raid is not really a theme. Like you'll put individual cards in your deck, but you're not like playing Ryle, for example.
Right. Ryle doesn't end up being an important card. And speaking of important cards, let's take a look at the red-green dinosaurs key commons. Some of these are going to be, like Luis said earlier, kind of cards that you're just going to put into any deck that can play the colors. But Tillinolli's Knight, is a real headliner in the deck. It's basically a 3/3 for 2 mana. And in a beatdown deck where you're trying to leverage combat tricks and removal to get blockers out of the way, that's the real deal. That is certainly where you want to be. Thrash of Raptors ends up being a very good attacker. That's the 4 mana 3/3, but it gets +2/+0 and trample if you control another dinosaur. And that thing hits hard. For a common at 4 mana, hitting for 5 with trample is a big deal. And it also does work well with combat tricks because your opponents are going to feel forced to block it. Lest they take too much damage. And Friendly Fire Cannon Blast, of course, are here as important cards. Frenzied Raptor, that's the 4/2 for 2 and a red. you're playing it. Look, this isn't the best Magic card ever printed, but it's a lot of power for a relatively cheap ability, and it's a relevant creature. Sort of one of the classic curves out that you see is Tillinolly's Knight into Frenzied Raptor. That's something that happens all the time. You swing in for 3. There's really nothing in the format that blocks well that early, and then you're sitting there with effectively 7 power, and you say go. That's a big deal.
This is the kind of board where if you have a follow-up removal or trick, your opponent has really no choice but to get completely trounced by it. Exactly.
And also, Luis, you and I have talked on and off throughout the course of this set about those, the slower decks, right? The not cabs decks, the ones where let's say you stumble a little, you don't have a 2-drop. And I'm on the play and I go, Tillinolly's Knight, go. And your turn 3 play is, I'm going to play New Horizons on my land. Go. And I go Thrasher Raptors hit you for 3. You have a ton of pressure. And if I'm on the play, forget it, right?
Yeah, you're on the play,
you're taking 3, you're facing down 7. Yeah, you're just basically dead at that point. So Frenzied Raptor, yes, you are going to play it. You can play Commune with Dinosaurs in this deck, though it's not super critical. But it is relatively low impact on your deck in the sense that it replaces itself with a land or a creature almost every time and just for 1 mana. So don't be afraid to play one, but it's not something you need. Colossal Dreadmaw. You actually do want one of these in the deck. This thing is just bigger than everything else at common. It's just the biggest, hardest to block thing. And even though you're not getting an extremely great rate at 6 mana, it's certainly a fair price to pay for it. And when you get to the later part of the game, which does happen, even in these aggressive decks that we talk about that don't want to get to that point, they don't always succeed. Sometimes you just block or have a couple removal spells. Sometimes you flat out a little bit. You play one of these, your opponent's going to draw a 3/3. At the best. And you're like 6/6 trample, go. It's like they have a major problem on their hands. The thing blocks and attacks really well. And then Pounce, of course, is an important piece of the puzzle here as well, because this is really the best possible deck for Pounce. This is where Pounce wants to
This is where Pounce actually looks as good as it's supposed to be.
Exactly. Because you and I talked about it last week for Merfolk, where we were saying, you can kind of take it or leave it. It kills small stuff sometimes, or maybe you get a little value as your creature's on the way out or whatever. But here, it's nice. It can actually get the job done. Grazing Whiptail will make the cut in here, though it actually goes much better in the other version that we're going to talk about after this. But you can play it. And then I also mentioned Tishana's Wayfinder, because you need curve out creatures that have power and toughness. And Tishana's Wayfinder has that. So
I wouldn't be surprised if you ended up taking Wayfinder over Grazing Whiptail a lot of the time, too.
In this deck, definitely. Absolutely. This is a curve out deck, and the Whiptail is playable, but not premium. In fact, I would probably put it in the filler section here, rather than in the key commons section. So filler, Grazing Whiptail, Nest Robber. Look, Nest Robber, it's like the little tiny Frenzied Raptor, and it's pretty bad. You do have to do it, though.
Value from haste a lot of the times because it just can't attack.
It just can't attack. And it is a dinosaur, so you will make it will make the cut. Sometimes you just need 2 drops.
Sometimes you picked up 3 Tillinolly's Knights and you just need dinosaur number 7.
Yes, that's true. That happens. And unfortunately, sometimes it's Nest Robber. Brazen Buccaneers, you talked about that. Same thing here. Fathom Fleet Firebrand's good, right? You need 2 drops, and this one doesn't really do anything for the deck outside of just its baseline. But you know what? You got to run cards like that in these decks, because there's not just a whole bunch of premium common 2-drop. Once you're out of Tillinolly's Knights, it's now you're in the Nest Robber camp, and you'd much rather have a Fathom Fleet Firebrand here.
Same with Deeproot Warrior, which you've got here.
Yeah, Deeproot Warrior, Blossom Dryad, whatever. These are all just junky. A better example is Ixalan's Keeper. Yep, you got to run it sometimes. Ravenous Daggertooth. You'll sometimes put a Suncrown Hunters in here. I think some people are a little too high on Suncrown Hunters. Okay card, but, for example, I'd rather have Colossal Dreadmaw most of the time than a Suncrown Hunters. Premium uncommons, as you mentioned, any deck that can play it is going to play Charging Monster Sword. This is its natural environment, though. The red green deck is really perfect for it because of one of the best possible cards that you can get for the deck, which is Otepec Huntmaster. This card is stupid in the deck, just really dumb. It lets you just dump out a bunch of stuff from your hand way earlier and give those cards haste. And your opponent, if they're trying to race, is going to fall behind very, very quickly to an Otepec Huntmaster. So it's really important. The other premium 2-drop here is Drover the Mighty.
This is just one of the best cards you can open.
Yeah, it really is. And in fact, this is often part of the reason how you end up in the deck. I'll talk about that in a second. But Drover the Mighty is fantastic. fantastic in this deck. Really, really great. And then, of course, you get access to Raging Swordtooth. And, the gold cards in a given color pair, they vary on power level. And Raging Swordtooth's pretty good. Like, it actually does pretty well. Yeah, so that's a nice one. And then, of course, you get Savage Stomp as well. And once again, that would go basically into any green deck in the format, but this is where you want it. This is where it's
when you Savage Stomp off Frenzied Raptor on turn 4 to, kill their, 2/2 or whatever, and then just get your attack in, it is just gross.
It is disgusting. So there's a lot. I mean, as you noted, there's a lot of really good premium uncommons, and, and then you get some of the other just like uncommon removal spells and stuff too. But here, these cards really shine. How do you get into the deck? Well, usually, from my experience, I've started out in red. I got a Monstrosaur or a Lightning Strike, or, maybe even just one of the common removal spells. And so I've started out there and picked up a couple of decent red cards. Maybe I'm thinking, well, I could be this, I could be that. And then I get a 5th pick Drover the Mighty, right? Or a 4th pick or something like that. Or I pick up a Savage Stomp or some other just insanely good green card that just goes into these decks perfectly well. And I'll start veering over in that direction. So that's how I've usually, do you have any thoughts on how you've gotten into the deck? It's kind of weird to reverse engineer this.
Well, I think one of it is that there are more premium uncommons for this deck than a lot of them. And especially like Otepec Huntmaster, Drover of the Mighty, Raging Swordtooth, they're all very focused on red-green.
Yeah.
Monstrosaur and Savage Stomp, like you said, they're fine. You'll play them anywhere. But because there's some specific red-green payoffs, then you end up there because you first picked Drover or Swordtooth. Or you just start out red, you notice that red and green are open. This is very much one of those more flexible decks that you don't have to have tons and tons of dinos to be a decent dino deck.
Right, totally. So that's how I end up getting in. The skeleton is pretty straightforward. You are still trying to curve out, so you do want, 3, 4, maybe 5 2-drops, depending. Tillinolly's Knight, of course, being the real kind of premium common there. Your curve is going to be pretty normal, 4 to 6 3-drops. Yes, you're going to play Frenzied Raptor, etc. And then you want 2 to 4 4-drops, 1 to 3 5s. And yes, you usually do end up playing a 6-dropper, sometimes 2 in this deck, which is a little bit of a no-no for the more low to the ground aggressive decks. But this is where you can get a bit of an advantage. Like I said, even at common, you can pick up cards like Colossal Dreadmaw, which can have a big impact on the board late. This version doesn't usually play the 7-drops. You can, but it's generally not advisable to
clear,
do so.
No version plays the Brontodons.
I know, man. I know. All right. Gregory knows. We all know. He didn't quite make it on the team, as it turned out. So this version is more aggressive, right? So cards like Sure Strike go up in value. Crash the Ramparts, while not a super strong card, it's fine here. You can play it for sure. And part of the reason you get into the deck, of course, are the red removal and burn spells you'll often start off with. Use them to prevent double blocks on your bigger threats by getting blockers out of the way proactively, or enticing your opponent into a double block if your burn spell's instant speed, like Unfriendly Fire. And what you're going to find is that if you are able to get out on the front foot, your opponents are going to be forced to double block in many scenarios, and you can really leverage these. I mean, a Sure Strike, when your opponent just goes like double block, you're like, yeah, you just get to destroy them.
You just get to scoop them up at that point.
Yeah. And then you also have to sometimes just use them. Like one good little 1-2 punch is Frenzied Raptor. Right? You attack with it, and they're like, okay, fine, I'll trade off my 2/2 for 2 with it or whatever. And then you have Crash the Ramparts, and it's like, wow.
Yeah, they just took 5.
Yeah, they just took 5 damage and lost their creature. That doesn't get to happen too many times before the game's over. So, this is the place for those things. And you're going to want to use them. But this deck is really straightforward. There's just nothing fancy going on here. It's just that your creatures are a little bigger than like the decks that we just talked about. If you're playing against Black-Red Pirates, your creatures are going to be a bit bigger, but you're also going to be a little bit slower, and you're not going to have quite as good of a curve-out potential as that deck does. I do not play Pirate's Cutlass in this deck. I feel like somehow compelled to note that at this point, given how many decks we've covered that do play it.
Yes, I agree.
Another one, so then there's kind of a subtype, which is a sub-archetype here, which is red-green ramp. And then it's usually not just red-green. It often has white in it as well. But this is a different deck. This does not have the same things that this one wants. It leans on It leans less on fragile attackers like Frenzied Raptor or maybe Nest Robbers or whatever, and tends to go more towards defensive bodies like Grazing Whiptail or maybe even Ixalan's Diviner, that type of card, to get itself to the late game where it can dominate with big threats and mana sinks and things that are just much bigger and stronger than what your opponent's able to put out. But cards like Headstrong Brute, Brazen Buccaneers, Crash the Ramparts, Sure Strike, these ones go down a lot in value in this version of the deck because you really just want to sort of set up so that your opponent can't kill you and get yourself to the big stuff. Cards like Blossom Dryad, Rummaging Goblin, Ixalan's Diviner, New Horizons, Colossal Dreadmaw I mentioned before, but these are all cards that are not so amazing in the other deck, and you kind of want them in this deck. Like, I'm not willing to say that they're great because, to be honest, this deck isn't great. This is not one of the premium archetypes in the format. But it does exist, and you do find yourself in the seat sometimes where you just don't get one of the sweet aggressive decks that can just beat down and curve out and have all this stuff.
Basically, what'll happen is if you're in the seat for this, it means that red and green are open, but you're not seeing enough of the like Tillinolly's Knights and like Fathom Fleet Firebrands that you're really not going to be able to pressure your opponent that effectively. But you can ramp into Colossal Dreadmaw, Verdant Sun's Avatar, Thundering Spineback, and kind of win a longer game because you have the tools and the card quality. You just don't have the essentially the 2-drops. So you just have to change your focus a little bit. But yes, this is, this like white-green ramp, which is basically the same thing, just with an emphasis on white, is not a deck you should be in unless it's very open and it's very clear you're forced into it. Whereas like you can be the second or third Vampires deck at the table and still end up with a fine deck.
Right. And you'll know exactly because you're all three of the Vampire decks at the table are trying to build the best version of the same type of deck. This one's different. This one's a little bit off the map as far as that goes. And to be clear, if given the choice, I'd much prefer the first version. That deck is just much more clean, much more straightforward, and has some pretty cool stuff going on. Where this
less
one
consistency issues.
Exactly, that's the main thing. So premium uncommons for this deck. Odebek Huntmaster is still fantastic here. In fact, it's even better in this deck. Cards like Ranging Raptors goes up. You do splash in here occasionally. You get cards like New Horizons and such that you actually have a place to put the mana. And sometimes you do want some white cards in here, so that's a thing.
It also just punishes them much more than in the red-green deck because you just have a 7-drop.
Exactly. And they're like, you've played a 2/3 for 3. And they're like, well, you're going to get some value when these trade or when I block, but so? Like, you don't have anything to spend it on. And they'd be right. Snapping Sailback's pretty good here. And then you mentioned it a second ago, but this is sort of the premium non-rare payoff card is Thundering Spineback. It sets you up to have a good immediate board impact. A 5/5 and then pumping up your other dinosaurs is no joke when you do get to 7 mana. And then if you get to untap with it, you start spitting out 4/4 dinos. And, that ends the game quite quickly. So this is, I think that when I think of this deck, Thundering Spineback is a card that comes to mind for me because you would never put a Thundering Spineback in the first version of this deck or very rarely. And here it's like, this is kind of what you're building towards. And then of course there's rares. Luis mentioned a few of them as well that are even better or just flat out excellent. But, at the cards that you'll see draft in and draft out, a Thundering Spineback you'll see often. And it's like, well, where's the home for that? And in my mind, this is it. It's red-green ramp. That's what you want to be doing. And as you mentioned before, Gregory, sadly, no. I think that the Ancient Brontodon is just not. You just can't play it in any deck. I don't think it's ever correct to put it in your deck. So the deal is this deck is really powerful if it curves out correctly and cleanly, but boy, it can be really tricky to do so. Taking a turn off for New Horizons.
You just look like a fool because you're playing New Horizons or a Blossom Dryad, and they're like, okay, play a Headstrong or a Heartless Brute, and just get in there.
And they just smash you, right? You take a turn off for New Horizons, or if you miss, this is one thing that happens. If you miss on your Explore creatures too often, and you're like, Ixalan's Diviner, 0/3, go, and they're like, cool, attack with all my stuff. You're like, oh no. If you do make it to the late game and get like a Thundering Spineback or whatever going, it's game over. I mean, you are going to win. The payoff is there, and it's pretty good. But this is a major consistency issue that you do need to play cards that don't affect the board, and you are going to look at an opening hand that has a Thundering Spineback and a 5-drop in it. Right. I mean, even if it's 7 cards, I'm not sure I'm in love with that hand. Even if it's 3 lands, a 2-drop, a 3-drop, like you're obviously keeping, but like, you're not going to see that spine back hit the battlefield for a long time.
This is also the deck that is forced to lose to Sure Strike, right? When they just have to block, their opponent's 3-drop with your 5-drop that you ramped out. They Sure Strike it, then play another 2-drop, and you're like, why am I doing all this work?
Right, exactly. Yeah, that happens all the time. How do you get into it? Well, usually you have some of the pieces, right, for the other stuff, but you end up with a bigger top end than you aimed for. And the other stuff just wasn't there. So you got a note to pick Huntmaster or two, which is like pretty sweet. And then, at some point you picked up, like I said, a Thundering Spineback, even though you were kind of in the market for Till and Ollie's Knights. And next thing you know, you just didn't get there. You just do not have a viable, aggressive game plan. Then you kind of backdoor into this version. Also, I kind of brushed over it, but, this deck often does have the ability to splash, and you can move into white or maybe even another color, if you want to. The red-green version really would love to play Territorial Hammerskull, but unfortunately it doesn't fit super well. Trying to splash for it, and it's not good here. Either. Yeah, that's the problem. So, keep your eye out for stuff like that. But for the most part, you do have the tools at your disposal to get the job done here within this color pair. But if you see something sweet, an Ixalan's Binding or things like that, go for it. You can usually splash them in this deck as well. Weaknesses, we already covered, right? It's slow. It's clunky.
We spent plenty of time on that.
Yeah. I think we've probably got the point.
Are we in love with
here.
this deck? The answer is no.
Not so much, right? The problem is just that there's too many good aggressive decks that have curve out potential to just kill you if you stumble, and the sad truth is that sometimes they kill you even if you don't stumble.
Yeah, that's the same thing with the blue-black, grindy pirate deck. Is like it's you don't get a pass. You don't automatically win the late game. So.
No, and so that's the tough part.
So we've actually covered all the tribes now, and one of the interesting things I want to note, before we wrap up, is there isn't a ton living outside of this.
Really not.
We have summarized, I think, with these decks about 90% of the decks you're going to draft in this format, maybe more.
Weird, right? I guess that's what we could expect.
Pirates, red-white aggro, red-green aggro, and that's just how this set is built. Yeah. So. we'll have plenty to talk about. It's not that, Ixalan's going to be here for a while, and we will be able to explore the format more. But in terms of archetypes, broad-based archetypes, this really is what we're looking at.
Yeah. Could be a long few months.
Yeah, well,
it could be.
We got iconic masters. Maybe we'll go a little deeper on that than normal.
Yeah, we could. We'll see. I'm not hating the format. I'm not in love with it, but I do tend to find that as I work my way through, a more diverse format tends to stay more interesting. And this one is well, do you want to be aggro pirates or do you want to be aggro merfolk? It's well, okay, and they do play out differently.
It's not that the decks play out all the same or that the decks aren't interesting, but. In Hour of Devastation, we saw the week 7 metagame and the week 9 metagame and the week 5 metagame were all fairly different for Hour as more things evolved. I don't see that happening here, but we'll find out.
Yeah, hopefully we get some evolution there. Next week we're aiming to do the sealed episode, given that the next week is a sealed Grand Prix for the format in Phoenix. So hopefully we'll be able to get to that. I've been doing some sealed. I think we'll be in decent shape to get that thing banged out. We know you guys like getting those earlier, and so we've been trying to make that happen. That is going to do it for this one, though. Hopefully it's helpful for you as you work your way through Ixalan as a format and get down to draft. Concentrate on these main archetypes and try to get good at those, because you're usually going to be able to find one of these open at the table. And then if you're the type of person who likes to draft a ton like Luis and I do, then you can go down the more, narrow routes.
Yeah, there's plenty to learn here. Knowing when to audible into the different versions of each deck, knowing, what is a sign that something's open versus not. It's not like this is super simple, but this is the broad-based strokes of where you're going to end up. Right.
If you want to find us on social media, it's pretty easy. I'm Marshall_LR, and Luis is LSV. Come say hi on Twitter or wherever you go. If you want to find everything related to the podcast, it's lrcast.com. That has links to all of our stuff, Luis's stream and the YouTube channel and blah, blah, blah. It's all there at lrcast.com. Got to mention the sponsor as well, channelfireball.com. If you want to fill out those last few cards for your constructed deck or even sell some back. I mention this on the show pretty frequently, but I think it's something that people don't do enough, which is grab a pile of rares that you've drafted or just kind of have sitting around, you're never going to make them into a deck, right? They're just going to sit there. And once they rotate out of standard, you're going to be mad because they all just plummeted in value. Well, you can get value back out of them. And this is an important piece of the puzzle for a Magic player because of the fact that Magic's expensive. It just is. So, you can go on to CFB, see how much they'll give you for them. If you want to trade them in for store credit to get more booster packs or singles or whatever, you're going to get a 30% bonus. And you can send them back to them. It's great. It's a really convenient, easy way to make sure that you get to keep playing this game that we all love. Channelfireball.com is the place to go for that and everything else that we talked about earlier. That is going to do it for the show this week. Thanks so much for spending some time with us, and we'll see you next week.
So Marshall Paulo has a series on Channel Fireball called Tiny Edges. Mm-hmm. And he's looking at like little things in gameplay that can increase your edges. And
I like that, by the way.
I had inspiration for one myself, tiny useless edges. And I've got some good examples of really useless ways we've tried to go deep.
Oh, I love this.
So the first one is deciding whether to play City of Brass or Mana Confluence in Vintage. So they're both lands that tap for any color of mana. Mm-hmm. City of Brass deals 1 damage to you whenever it becomes tapped. Mana Confluence says tap, pay 1 life. Basically the same card. In fact, 99% of the scenarios, it's the same card.
Yeah.
There's some key differences, though. City of Brass, if it gets tapped down by something like Tangle Wire or Fire Ice, does 1 damage to you. Mana Confluence does not. On the other hand, because City of Brass is a trigger, you can tap it for a red mana and Lightning Bolt your opponent down to 0 before you die when you're at 1. Mana Confluence doesn't let you do that.
Okay.
One tiny useless edge is trying to decide between the two of them. I usually go with City of Brass because Arabian Cities of Brass look really good.
Oh, yeah. That has to be a tiebreaker if it's even close. Those things are gorgeous.
Oh, yeah. Another one, this is one literally took all the effort or attention of our PT testing team as we were trying to decide our last slots in Cobblade. Stoic Rebuttal versus Cancel. Oh, this is, blue-black control. Cancel, 1 blue-blue counter-target spell. Stoic Rebuttal, 1 blue-blue counter-target spell, but it has Metalcraft. If you have 3 artifacts in play, it costs 1 colorless less.
Okay.
Our deck had a total of 3 artifacts in the main deck and 3 in the sideboard.
Okay. Well, it sounds like a free roll, right?
But the argument was it would never happen because you never bring in Stoic Rebuttal at the same time as you bring in the sideboarded artifacts, which were Ratchet Bombs, which you sacrifice, and you board out one of your artifacts anyway, so you're never going to have 3 in the same, or very rarely going to have 3 in the same time, in the same configuration. On the other hand, if you play Stoic Rebuttal, that might give them information that you have 3 artifacts in your deck. But it could be a bluff, so maybe playing Cancel gives them information that you don't.
You guys all sat around and talked about this?
Yes, I swear to God, if you ask Owen on Twitter about Stoic Rebuttal versus Cancel or PV, they will know exactly what I'm talking about. We spent so much time till it got banned. PV is actually doing tiny useless edges. I might actually ask him about this now because
that is so good.
We spent so much time arguing about it till people just started getting mad, and Owen would start yelling at you if you brought it up, or Paul would be like, "Let's stop talking about this," because we couldn't resist. We're like, "Yes, but what about 1 Stoic Rebuttal, 1 Cancel?" But then they're like,
"Oh my God."
If they see both, they know that you're trying to trick them, because if you had artifacts, you'd play 2 Stoic Rebuttals.
That is insane. Wait, I got to know where did you fall on?
We played Stoic Rebuttal. We couldn't. That's where we all ended up. Oh, I loved the argument. I was on both sides. I just loved it.
You were just playing the field.
We ended up playing Stoic Rebuttal. We wasted a lot of our life arguing it, and that is an example of some tiny useless edges.
Oh, that's great. I love it.